Hello and welcome to my study. This lesson that we're getting ready to video here was intended to be used in our Christmas Eve service, our Christmas Eve study at Huckleberry Springs Church. However, the weather did not cooperate and we had to cancel. But we wanted to share this. We wanted to be sure that we got this last lesson in the culmination of this series. If you've watched the other videos, then you know that we've been doing a series this year titled The End from the Beginning. This comes from God's words in Isaiah 46 verses 9 and 10, which says, I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things which have not been done. As we've seen in our study, this does not mean that God can simply distinguish the end from the beginning, that he could just tell the difference between the end and the beginning. Nor does it mean that God, being omniscient, can look down through the corridors of time and give us a heads up as to what's going to happen. No, God declares, God determines what will be the end, what will happen in the end in the very beginning, before any of it has ever happened. That's prophecy. Prophecy is simply the recording of history in advance, before it ever happens. I knew when I started this series, when I began planning for Advent and what I would teach during this year, I knew what I felt God was leading me to do, leading me to convey in this series of lessons. But I'll just tell you, more than once I've said, God, I can't do this. More than once I felt like I've bitten off more than I can chew. But we just kept plugging along, and then now in this lesson we have arrived. Finally, we're in Bethlehem. When I was growing up, my mother had this saying. Well, mother had a lot of sayings. But whenever she'd been to town or somewhere where she had to make a lot of different stops and it basically took all day, when she got home, she'd say, I've been all over the world and parts of Georgia today. Well, we've been all over the world, all over history, and all over the Bible in this series. We've based this series on the book of Daniel and the visions that Daniel had and the interpretation of the future that God gave him. So in essence, we've gone from Babylon to Bethlehem by way of the world. As we began, I encouraged you to read the book of Daniel, because even if some of the prophecies and the visions are hard to understand, still Daniel teaches us how to live a faithful life, even in the midst of captivity, even during persecution, even when you feel like you have absolutely no control in any given matter. And don't world events just make us feel that way now? We talked in our first Advent lesson about the book of Daniel and its trustworthiness, and we saw that Jesus himself referred to Daniel as Daniel the prophet. And so we can trust the validity of the book. We also talked about the history of Israel and about Daniel as the young man and how he came to be in this place at this time. The prophecies of Daniel cover from Daniel's own time in the latter part of the 600 BC on up to AD 33 to the very day, I might add, that Jesus entered Jerusalem on what we call Palm Sunday. We'll be picking that back up in our study at Huckleberry Springs in the new year. But the prophecies in Daniel also take us to Jesus' second coming, to what I've often called to infinity and beyond. As Daniel chapter 2 began, we saw that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream which looks into the future, and it reveals 4 earthly kingdoms that will come to power, and then a 5th kingdom that verse 44 of chapter 2 says will endure forever. So without taking too much time in this recording, here is the dream and the interpretation that Daniel was given. This is found in Daniel chapter 2. I'm going to read verses 31 through 40. You need to read the first part of chapter 2 to get the setting for this and see the importance of what is happening here. But at any rate, Daniel now is standing before Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, "You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of an extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome." It was full of awe. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. "You continued looking," he told Nebuchadnezzar, "until a stone was cut without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone which struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." Verse 36 continues, "This was the dream. Now we shall tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given," and remember the importance of that phrase, has given the kingdom, the power, and the strength, and the glory. "And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand, and has caused you to rule over them. You are the head of gold. And after you there shall arise another kingdom inferior to you, and then a third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. And then there will be a fourth kingdom, as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things. So like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces." And then verse 41 on gives the rest of the picture of this statue, the feet and the toes, how they are made, and then how that final stone cut without hand comes in and crushes all that. But that is the picture of the statue. That was the dream, the picture of the statue, and what Daniel shared with the king. This is a picture of world empires to come from man's view. From man's view, all is bright and shiny. And that's all that Daniel was given at this time. However, some 50 years later, when he is a much older man, in chapters 7 through 12, Daniel was given visions of these empires and terrifying details as how they would rule and control the world in the coming centuries, and even things that were future still in our day today. But the visions that Daniel saw involved these grotesque animals, these birds of prey, these things that nightmares are made of. They were vile and wicked and brutal beyond imagination. As we said, man's view of the world's accomplishments are bright and shiny. But God views the world from its internal character, from its heart. And Jeremiah 17:9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked." That was in our first lesson and in our overview. In our second Advent lesson, we looked at those first few kingdoms, the head of gold and the arms and chest of silver. These two empires were Babylon and Persia. We know the first was Babylon because Nebuchadnezzar is told, "You are the head of gold." In chapter 7, Babylon then is depicted as a lion with wings that will be humiliated by having its wings plucked out. And Persia did humiliate Babylon, in the way that they conquered them. Persia then is that bear that is larger, raised up on one side than the other. That's how he's depicted in chapter 7, and then he's depicted as a ram with one horn larger than the other in chapter 8. And this comes from the fact that the empire of Persia actually began as a confederation of nations, including the nations of Media and Persia. They called the Medo-Persia Empire. But Persia was stronger and eventually dissolved the Media side. As Babylon and then Persia ruled the world on the world stage, we looked in that lesson that the books of Jeremiah, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and the prophets of Zechariah Haggai, and Malachi were recorded the events concerning ordinary, everyday life, individual Jewish people, and how God's plan for these people continued to be fulfilled even within captivity and even within persecution. Babylon and Persia ruled on the world stage, but life went on in Israel. But what we saw in that lesson, as we looked at a couple of incidences in the life of Esther and Nehemiah, was that even though we may feel like we're not in control or we have no real say in anything, still God allows us to participate, and so we must remain faithful. In our third lesson, we looked at the next two elements from Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the belly of bronze and the legs of iron and clay. These two components correspond to the empires of Greece and Rome. Greece is depicted as a leopard with wings and 4 heads in chapter 7, and then in chapter 8 as a shaggy goat, which represents, he has the wings in that picture. Lost my place. Chapter 8, he's that shaggy goat. That represents not only Greece, but Greece's first king, Alexander the Great, and he has that one conspicuous horn. The leopard with the wings is a picture of the swiftness with which Alexander would conquer, and the 4 heads represent the 4 generals. And in particular, one descendant from that line of generals, Antiochus Epiphanes, that egotistical madman who would desecrate the temple in Jerusalem by slaughtering a pig on the altar and erecting a statue to Zeus in the Holy of Holies. That brought on the Maccabean revolt and the festival that culminates in what we know as Hanukkah today. It's a fascinating story we just don't have time to dig into. But then, about 100 years after this revolt, Rome would come on the scene and is depicted in chapter 7 as a dreadful and terrifying beast that would be extremely strong with iron teeth. But most of what Daniel was told about Rome in these visions actually blends into that final empire, that one that is yet to come, even in our day, that will ultimately be crushed by the kingdom that chapter 2 told us was cut without hands. That's another study for another day, but what we really need to see here is how God continued to work even when everyone thought he was being silent. Everything about the empires of Greece and Rome take place in what is referred to as the intertestamental period of time. That's that 400 period time frame when in the Old Testament, which is known as the silent years. Those years between Malachi, as the Old Testament ended, and the New Testament begins with the book of Matthew. And while we don't have any scripture to turn to look at for that time period, God did not speak to man for those 400 years. Still, we see that God may have been silent, but that does not mean that he was not working. He was preparing, as he always was, from the foundations of the earth for the fullness of time, for that perfect time. First, we see that the perfect time had to be prepared religiously. We saw, as the book of Daniel began, that the Babylonians carried the children of Israel into exile, but it was during that exile period that the books of the Old Testament were compiled, and the synagogue system of worship was created. Before the exile, the Jews had what was called a gathered culture. That was their system of worship. Everyone went to the temple for their worship, and they worshiped nowhere else. In other words, they had a central place of worship, but during the exile, they couldn't get to the temple. They couldn't go there, and so they began gathering in small groups to worship wherever they were exiled. The Greek word for gather is synagogue, where we get the word synagogue. They would synagogue together to worship, much like our local churches today. Then, when Persia defeated Babylon, they allowed the Israelites to return to their homeland. And as we saw, the temple was rebuilt and temple worship was reinstated. But synagogues too were built during that time. They were built all throughout the land. And after the exile, and even up until the destruction of the temple in AD 70, the Jews participated in their temple sacrifices. They participated in that once again, but the local synagogues were very important for religious instruction. In fact, many times the rabbi, who was the leader of the local synagogue, was more influential than the high priest in Jerusalem. So it was prepared religiously. Next, the perfect time had to be prepared culturally. And God did that through Alexander the Great. Oh man, there's so much I would like to share about Alexander the Great. But just in a nutshell, the Greeks thought that the Greek culture of Hellenization to the world, they brought that as they conquered the known world. They brought a way of life, they brought trade, they brought diplomacy, but most importantly, they brought language. They brought the Greek language. Now, this was not classical Greek. This was a simpler version called Koine Greek. The Koine Greek became the language of commerce and thus of the world. I mean, you've heard the phrase, money talks. Koine Greek did. The Greek language in that era was like English today. It was spoken universally. And then the perfect time had to be prepared physically. And that's where Rome came in. The Romans were geniuses at movement and engineering. They created a system of roads whereby the whole world could travel. In fact, today, there are still Roman roads today throughout Europe. And did you know that Rome was the first to use mile markers? You know, we have mile markers on our interstate system. Well, Rome was the first to use mile markers. There were mile markers all along the Roman roads, so one would actually know how far from Rome they were at any given time. Another thing that Rome brought was something that was called the Pax Romanus, a worldwide peace of sorts, allowing travel to take place throughout the known world. You might ask, why is that important? When Jesus barely traveled outside of Israel and primarily spoke Aramaic? Think about this. When the Apostle Paul began his missionary journeys, the first place he went in every city was where? To the synagogues. The local synagogue, the Jewish gathering place of worship, because the world had been prepared religiously. Paul could communicate everywhere he went because Koine Greek was the known language, the universal language, and so the world had been prepared culturally. And Paul could travel the known world because of the Pax Romanus, because the world had been prepared physically. Now that the external world had been prepared, what about the characters of the story? Well, because Rome was a world empire with millions of citizens and a great army and a great infrastructure to maintain, it needed money. And because the Roman Empire needed money, there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And so we ended in our last lesson as we found a young man and his even younger wife being great with child headed from Nazareth toward Bethlehem when they had no intention of going to Bethlehem at all. And so finally, we're in Bethlehem. From Babylon to Bethlehem. Not a minute too early, not a minute too late. God is always on time, and God is always in time. We can count on it. We've often talked in our studies about some of the brightest prophecies in Scripture being given at some of the darkest times in history. At Christmas last year, no one could have predicted what would take place in 2020. Our world has changed. But we need to know that no matter what we're going through, no matter what we will face in this coming year, nothing takes God by surprise. Never has God said, whoa, I didn't see that coming. And so his timing is perfect. Galatians 4:4 and 5 puts it this way. But when the fullness of time was come, when it was the perfect time, when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem that were under the law, that we might receive the kingdom, the adoption as sons. What we have learned from Daniel and Esther and Nehemiah and the myriads of unnamed believers down through the ages is that no matter what happens, we must remain faithful. Whether we are in captivity, whether we're being persecuted for our faith, or whether we have the freedom to stand and speak, we must remain faithful because God is truly faithful to us. As we left that young couple, they had just arrived in Bethlehem, and we pick up their story now, beginning with Luke chapter 2, verse 6. And so it was that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. And there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and they were sore afraid. I love this about the King James Version. They were sore afraid. They were so afraid it hurt. They were sore afraid. And the angel said unto them, Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. And this shall be a sign unto you. You shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger. And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. And it came to pass, as the angels were gone away from them into Bethlehem, gone away from them into heaven, the shepherds came and said to one another, Let us now go even unto Bethlehem, and see this thing which is come to pass, which the Lord hath made known to us. And they came with haste, and found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in a manger. And when they had seen it, they made known abroad the saying which was told them concerning the child. And all that heard it wondered at those things which were told them by the shepherds. But Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. And the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things that they had heard and seen, as it was told unto them. And there was so much more. So much more I would like to share. So much more that we just don't have time for. We've gone from Babylon to Bethlehem, but I really wanted to connect Bethlehem back to Babylon. I wanted to share how the Magi knew to come to Jerusalem. We have Daniel's writings, and so don't you suppose they had them too? I wanted to share about the star. You've likely heard about the Christmas star that was visible this year for the first time in some 800 years. What did the Magi see from their home in Persia? What really guided them to that house where the baby Jesus crawled around by that time, or maybe even toddled by that time? I mean, stars don't stop and stop. Stars don't shine, at least so that we could see them in the daytime, but this one did. So much I'd like to share, but let me close with this. In the hymn, O Holy Night, there is a line that says, A thrill of hope, the weary world rejoices. We are a weary world, are we not? But take hope. 700 years before that night, 700 years before that Bethlehem night, Isaiah would prophesy it this way. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. And so the time in history was right, the place on earth was right, and the child was born. And the Son was given for the redemption of sin. That part has been fulfilled. And because these prophecies, all these prophecies that we've read about, have been fulfilled to the letter, you can count on the fact that Jesus will return for His church. And He will come to fulfill the rest of Isaiah's words at just the right time. God has declared the end from the beginning. May that bring you joy, peace, and hope. And may God bless you in this Christmas season and into the coming year. Amen.